Hi, my name's Ian. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to this series of reviews and overviews and histories of vintage role-playing games and the odd board game thrown in here and there. Before we get into this episode, I'd just like to address a question that came up as to why am I doing this? Why am I reviewing these old editions? Why am I showing how the rules worked, how to create characters in these old games? Why not just provide some information on the new editions of the game? Why not just provide tutorials for those? Why not use the online tools that are available for these games? And the simple fact is, first off, I have an interest in history in general. And the history of the role-playing game hobby, as it grew, is one that grew up with me. The hobby started in 1974, really took off with Dungeons and Dragons. Before that, it was war games and additions to war games and expansions to games like Diplomacy and so on. But the industry itself can be traced directly back to 1974, when I was 4. So really, the games that came in as they developed, I saw them develop through the pages of the magazines that I was buying, like White Dwarf and Imagine and Dragon Magazine. Articles for games that I didn't play, but nevertheless I could read through and get a feel for those games. And that led me to play games, other games than the ones that were popular at the time. So I have quite a broad knowledge of the role-playing game industry as it developed, and also having sort of briefly been in it for a while, wrote a few things here and there. For me, it's an important thing for the industry as a whole, where it's largely corporate driven. It's not so much hobbyists writing these games for hobbyists anymore. It's not gamers for gamers. It's more corporates selling games. So role-playing games, especially games like Dungeons and Dragons that are now owned by Hasbro, have taken a route more down the road of Monopoly and games such as that, where they're packaged and they're pretty and they're handed to people on a plate. Whereas where we came from as gamers, a lot of it was we were making them up on the fly. The rules were incomplete, necessarily so. They were a framework to allow people that were taken on board to stretch their imaginations and to come up with things. So the reason why I'm bringing this up in this one, because I think this particular edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which we're going to be dealing with 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons here, this is where I think the corporations took over and the glossy final product became the driving force behind things, rather than treating gamers on a level playing field in the creative construction of the game and of fields allowing their imagination to players and dungeon masters allowing their imaginations to create the environments in which they wish to play. The less emphasis on game world creation, homebrew stuff, creating your own worlds and the races and the creatures and everything else that inhabited it, and more an emphasis on feeding you storylines, feeding you products, feeding you campaign settings. But we'll get in that in a second. So here we have it, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition. So we're going to be picking up our story of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in 1989, which is where we finished off with the 1st edition video. If you haven't seen that, then and you want a scale of where Advanced Dungeons and Dragons came from, then have a jump back to there. That takes us all the way from 1977 to 1989. So where we are now, from 1985, a 2nd edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was already being discussed. Like I said, the game was first published in 1977, or 77 through to 79 for the core rules, and it had several books published for it between those that added rules, that expanded the game out and everything. So you ended up having a number of rule books to reference that didn't always make logical sense in their progression, just to do something simple as create a character. And if you jump into the 1st edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons character generation movie, you can see that I'm having to reference like 6 books or 5 books or whatever to create a single character. So really, by the end of the decade of its life, so 1987 or so, it really was time for a serious look at producing a second edition. And so from 1987, David Cook, who was one of the game developers that was on the staff at TSR, was tasked with basically ripping apart the first edition rules and seeing what could be reassembled back together and what needed tweaking and what needed changing around in order to produce effectively a compiled, condensed, easier to play, easier to manage, not so many rule books all over the place, but we'll see how that changed, and reset things. So this he did, and in the pages of Dragon magazine, he reasonably regularly came out with articles under the title of Who Dies? There's Who Dies and Who Dies Part 2, in order to explain some of the decisions that were being made, to ask for feedback on some of those decisions, a lot of which was acted on, and to keep things getting on the boil, to get people interested in the development process of second edition, and also to stir up interest in the new edition of the game, which it did. It was an exciting and trepidatious form of advertising or pushing the game forward. So by the time that 1988 came round and we started getting books out like the Greyhawk Adventures book, which had a label on it saying it was compatible for both the first and second edition editions of the game, and we saw that, and it was trying to fathom out some of what second edition would look like from looking at this book that was purportedly bridging the two games. So in May 1987. Dragon issue 121 came out, and this was really Dave's Cook, almost his final statement on this is the decision making that we're going to be following in the way that we are going forward with second edition. So there are some of the decisions that were being made, for example, the problematic classes, or those classes that were seen as problematic from first edition, either by game balance turns or their usefulness. We'll get into the idea of kits in a bit, but the idea that a cavalier needed to be a separate class rather than a different colour of the fighter class. Similarly, the barbarian, just what made the barbarian different from just being a fighter with a certain elements of colouring. So the barbarian and the cavalier class were being dropped. There was also a desire to promote heroic play more than anti-heroes or the gamut of swords and sorcery type stories or scenarios or whatever that were largely the focus of first edition and previous editions of Dungeons & Dragons. The works of people like Fritz Lieber and so on, which didn't portray unanimously good characters going off to doing heroic deeds, which you pretty much got with Tolkien, but rather anti-hero type characters, or characters that had nuances of grey to their characters, and they weren't wholly good, and it wasn't like shining paladins and heroic halflings or whatever going off to fighting things that were absolutely evil. So character classes that plugged into the idea that yes, you could have a heroic character that was nonetheless evil, were also dropped, and that was in the form of the assassin. In first edition, with the publication of Oriental Adventures, there was already discussion about whether the monk class had a place in the core rules that were nominally describing a Western European fantasy medieval setting. And that came to fruition within the second edition rules, as the monk class was also dropped from the core rules. And there were a lot of things that they were deciding that came out in those articles that were really really along the lines of some of the things that we had already got rid of or already modified in our house games. There's things like the weapon speeds and weapons versus armor types and all of this kind of thing that we had either simplified or ignored because they hampered play, made it too complicated. They're too much in the overcomplicated war game rule style of play, which even a lot of war games had backed away from. All of these, a massive table of weapon statistics, when really it could be abstracted down to just the general type of damage it does and how easy it is to wield, if it's going to slow you down, if it's a blooming great big axe or something, and the damage it does. So there's already a move away in games from those more complex aspects into more abstract simplifications of those. And the things that were being talked about in Dragon Magazine that were along those lines. It was, we want to get rid of all of these things that actually slow down and hamper the action of play to make bring things in line with the more abstract and simplified systems that will enhance that action and just make it easier to actually sit down and play a game with people. So those are a lot of things I could get on board with. It was like, well, we're doing a lot of this stuff already. Another thing that they were talking about is making clerics more aligned towards the deities that they'd chosen, which sort of started in the first edition book, Deities and Demigods, where they were saying, your clerics of this particular sort should really have this particular dress this way, or use these colours and carry these symbols. And what they were trying to do with second edition is to pull them more into, if you're a cleric of this particular god, then you can use these weapons instead of the bog standard cleric set. You can use, if you're worshipping a god that is a cold god, a god of the north, frosty north or whatever, then you might not have access to fire spells or spells that deal with deserts or that side of things. So, and we had already done this a little bit. If I remember, I think there was an article in White Dwarf at some point, or maybe we came up with it on our own. This was a long time ago, but we did this. We tailored the spell lists that were there. There was no sort of categorization. It was just like, here are the cleric spells, but we tailored the spell lists to the gods to say, like, this particular god. If you're a cleric of this particular god, then these are the spells that you can pick from for your character. So it looked like that sort of thing was going to be coming into second edition. So you could tell the difference between a frosty north god and a heat using lightning god from the deserts to the south. So whatever takes your fancy with that line. So it just seemed a lot of things that were going through, and it was also, if you looked at the pages of Dragon Magazine and White Dwarf and the number of classes that were produced for first edition game, the first edition AD&D game. I mean, stacks and stacks and stacks of them. Largely all different shades of the core classes. So you got a transmuter class, you got a necromancer class, you got an enchanter class or similar, and so on. And what they were talking about with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, instead of just having the magic user and the illusionist, they would use the illusionist as an example of a specialist wizard, but then draw all of the other ones out, conjurers, necromancers, whatever, the whole thing from the schools of magic that had already been established in first edition and so on. So there was a lot of that. Why do we need all of these classes when we can build the tools to be able to produce the effective what those classes are doing and providing into the core rules themselves? So it all seemed really good. And by the time 1988 came around, I was really looking forward to when the rulebooks were going to be published, which was going to be 1989 and 1990. And then, eventually, the Player's Handbook came out. Now, I'll give you a sense of how much play I did in second edition when this poor book went around the world DMing at various conventions and so on. But yeah, it's my second edition my second edition Player's Handbook is rather compare it, if you will, to my first edition one, which is in reasonably better nick, even though my childhood colouring practices were a little off. So yes, 1989, the Player's Handbook came out, and also in 1989, the kind Mr. Easley, for a charitable donation, drew one of my favourite non-player characters in there. And as you can see, that's our role-playing game association back in the day. And where my first edition Dungeon Master's Guide had a transcription, or a bastardization of the quote from the One Ring in the cover of it. This one has Jabberwocky. Can't remember. Probably one of the only poems that I can actually recite from heart. But anyway, so second edition, the Dungeons and Dragons came out, and the most notable thing that we saw, and it was sort of hinted at in the pages as well, was that this book, the Player's Handbook, was the core rule book. The rules were in here. So using this, it wasn't just a character generation tool, which was, more or less what the first edition Player's Handbook was. The rules for combat, for saving throws, for everything, they were in here. Notable things that were missing were things like psionics, which, not a bad thing. Psionics were really muddy in first edition. Strange character classes that broke the rules. I'm looking at you, Bard. The Bard was in here, but in a single classed sort of cross between a rogue and a magic user that had some knowledge and musical skills to going on with it, and all of the things that were promised as well in the articles leading up to it. So we had specialist priests, we had specialist wizards, we had the illusionist and the druid were in here as examples of those. We had the cavaliers and barbarians and assassins and monks had all gone. Non-weapon proficiencies were brought into the core of the game. So no having to look through two other rule books for those while you're creating characters. And so it was all condensed. Everything that we ended up needing 5 or 6 books to reference in order to just get through the character generation stage was now in one single book. Like I said, that was shortly to change, but for now, this was it. This was all we needed. And it's a testament, I think, to Dave Cook. The way that the second edition rule books were written and laid out was far clearer and far more approachable. It was easier to introduce new players to the game. The first edition rule books are quite text heavy, but fine print, big books, lots of rules and nuances to those hidden within various paragraphs. In second edition, it's all laid clear. It's not like encumbrance, for example. If you looked, you had to look in a particular paragraph in order to get the maximum load value of 1500, to which apply the strength modifier to generate what your maximum load was, and so. But all of that encumbrance stuff clearly laid out in the tables, akin to those in the Wilderness Survival Guide. But it was all in here. That was it. Really good. Fantastically written book. I got a lot of use out of this. Now I just want to step back a little bit and just give you a bit of a foreshadowing. I think is a foreshadowing in terms of what second edition, not the game rules, but the actual presentation of the game would become. So as we touched on in the first edition game, we had the Dragonlance Saga came out in 1984. A series of adventures, interlinked adventures, that presented a plot through which you were meant to guide your players, through which you were advised to keep certain characters alive, by obscure death, by gently, subtly ushering players down a particular route through the plot of the modules. And all of these sort of tie-in products that came through. So there were Dragonlance board games, there were Dragonlance novels, as we said, this started also to come into when the Forgotten Realms was published. There were a couple of books written for Greyhawk, but nothing along the lines of the Dragonlance Juggernaut, and certainly not along the lines of the Juggernauts that would come with the advent of second edition. So that concept of a whole product span surrounding a campaign or a plot line or whatever started to towards the end of first edition's run and into the early days of second edition really started to take hold. It was seen as this was the norm now. Location-based adventures were they were still going to be published during second edition, but they were always sort of second fiddle to the plot line type, the plot arc type things, the ones that could tie into other products and so on. So this kind of started with a sort of the expansion of the Forgotten Realms. So to start off, we had novels that were released in concert with the Forgotten Realms campaign setting box, the grey box. So we started off with that. We had the novels, the Moonshine trilogy, which started off with Darkwalker and Moonshine in 1987, that tied into the campaign enhancement setting book, the Forgotten Realms, FR2, the Moonshine Island. So you had the campaign setting, you had the novels, you had the campaign setting expansion that all tied that together. Similarly, you had that with the Icewind Dale trilogy. You had the Icewind Dale trilogy covered the area of the north, the far north of the Western Realms. That tied in to FR5, the Savage Frontier, which expounded on the north, and again expanded the Forgotten Realms campaign setting as a whole. And this was all sort of, you had, FR1 was Waterdeep, which I think was Ed Greenwood's sort of general area of focus and for a lot of his own games, him being the progenitor of the Forgotten Realms world. FR2 was Moonshine. FR3 was the Shining South. The FR3 dealt with Calimsham, the areas to the south, which the third novel of the Icewind Dale trilogy visited, and FR4 was the Magister, was a collection of spells and magical items. FR5 was the Savage Frontier, which tied into the north, which tied into the Icewind Dale trilogy. So already we've got 6 books and 5 campaign expansions within that period from 1987 to 1988. This is all precursors to second edition. In addition to that, in 1988 you had the novel Azure Bonds, again set in the Forgotten Realms world. This tied into the Heartlands, Cormyr and the Dalelands and so on, and the Moonsea. And tied into that, in 1989, you had the FRC series. So FRC 1 was Pools of Darkness, and FRC 2, Curse of the Azure Bonds, both released alongside or within a year of the SSI computer games that were generally established along the same plot, and the novels that also covered the similar concepts. I mean, the idea with the module is, and the computer game, is that they were sequels to the novel, more or less. But so you had this shift from the Tomb of Horrors style of thing, the Tomb of Horrors or the Eyrie of the Slave Lords or so on, which were largely either parts of short series or they were completely standalone, to this whole concept where everything was tied together as product packages, novels, computer games, expansions to campaign settings, adventures. They all were interlinked. But it wasn't too bad at this moment in time, because Forgotten Realms is a largely a fantasy medieval world, and if you look at its patchwork sort of countries that have rough equivalents to real life areas of history, the Moonshires are largely sort of British Isles, a British Isles kind of affair. Calimsham is like an Arabian Nights type area. Am is like a a Spain type area. Cormier is like a medieval France or a Romance medieval type area, and the north area there is like a frontier settlements as they're pushing and civilizing an area as run largely by barbarians, which you can kind of see in the sort of Scandinavian north, or the borderlands between the civilized parts of Europe and the not so civilized northern parts of Europe, or even in America, where you had that sort of, you know, points of civilization colonizing and spreading out from there. Probably not the right words to use in this current day and age, but that's the sort of kind of idea. You had these points of civilization, you had the barbarians that were indigenous to there, and, you know, a lot of the conflicts were built up between the two. And that's not so different from what we had before. In terms, the Greyhawk was a fantasy medieval world. You could see not direct parallels, but it was certainly European medieval knights and so on. In Mystara, you had some definite real-world parallels. Ethengar was Mongols. Karameikos was a sort of a medieval frontier kingdom. You had Thyatis, which was sort of Roman in origin. You had the northern kingdoms that were very much Vikings, that side of things. So everything had a parallel. And if you liked, you could see it that Forgotten Realms was a more expansive version of Mystara. Mystara was very compact, and consequently you had the countries would interact quite a lot with each other in the scope of a campaign. With Forgotten Realms, it was so big, so spread out, that you could choose whichever area that you wanted, that were interested in playing, and never go anywhere else, never touch any other part of the map. Then you could. Interest was like all sorts of things, but and we had planned long treks over to various parts of it. But it was like an amalgamation of a number of campaign settings all squashed into one, and I think that's why the Forgotten Realms sort of took over. It was more a case of, here is lots of campaign settings that can almost immediately interact with each other if you choose to put things over the borders between those campaign settings, but otherwise you don't need to go. So if you want a campaign setting of this particular theme, there is an area in the realms that will suit that theme, and if you want to have one that will cross over the borders, then you can bring in other themes as well, as either conflicts or alliances, or just to colour things a little bit differently. So I think that explains why the popularity of the Forgotten Realms, but more was to come. So one of the things that the Forgotten Realms started a tradition of, in terms of, you know, what we discussed about modules tying in with everything else, was with second edition, was why is the world suddenly following these rules and not those rules? And by that I mean, why are priests of gods like this now? Why is magic like this now? The differences between the way first edition did things and the way second edition did things. So with that came the concept of the metaplot that Dragonlance had done. You know, there was this metaplot going over, but not so much on the campaign level. The metaplot in Dragonlance followed the plot line that of the authors had laid out. The metaplot in Forgotten Realms explained changes to the world, and sometimes imposed them, either because the authors wanted, or TSR, or the Forgotten Realms developers wanted the campaign setting to go into a particular way, or they wanted an excuse for something to be introduced, or they wanted change to happen for whatever reason. So the changeover from first to second edition came with the Avatar trilogy. And the idea there was that the gods had come to there's all things like going on, and certain gods ended up being killed, and other mortals ended up being elevated to take their place, and all kinds of stuff. But at the end of it, the world was changed. The rules under which gods had originally followed and dealt with their practitioners had changed, coincidentally, into the way that clerics are now dealt with in the second edition rules. So there was a series of modules, a series of novels that provided a metaplot that people could play through and read, that flowed into the change between first edition and second edition. So there was a metaplot explanation for why the world is now this way under this new edition. But this opened up the difference, more differences between the campaign settings that they had floating around. Now let's just examine some of the campaign settings that they had. We can kind of discount the Lankmar campaign setting, because that was a sort of that was of interest to people that were fans of either the setting or Fritz Lieber's works, and it was a sort of a standalone type thing. It wasn't a dynamic, product-driven thing. The novels were already there for people to read. They didn't need to do anything else with them. So we're only going to be dealing with those three, the three extant ones that TSR had come up with that were supporting with novels and so on. And these were Dragonlance, Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms. So the major difference between those three, and why the Forgotten Realms was the one that was really pushed as the vehicle for second edition. So Greyhawk, the original idea behind Greyhawk was, here is the world, there you go, off you go and do something with it. And the novels were kind of similar to that. The written by Guy Jacks were very much sort of, here's a bunch of characters and here are they doing things, and explored the conflicts that were explained and hinted at within the Greyhawk box campaign settings. They didn't really push any kind of metaplot of the world forward. I mean, later Guy Jacks' books did, but that was after he'd left TSR and he was working under some kind of agreement with them. But those initial books weren't like that. The Dragonlance books definitely followed through that plot and the plot of the modules, and then after that the Dragonlance books then either went back and filled in some gaps, or they were of what happened next to these characters. But the large driving force behind the Dragonlance popularity, the Dragonlance world popularity, had gone away, which was the plot and the modules, those 16 modules that went alongside that trilogy of books, that everyone had that shared experience with in reading and playing through them if you played through them and so on. That had kind of gone away. It had been done, it had gone through, and you can kind of see that in the way that Dragonlance has been treated since. Because what it ended up doing was, yes, you had these novels that were hugely popular in their own right. Dragonlance as a literary phenomena, fairly easy to read fantasy books, but it became a driving force. They're bestsellers. They're bestsellers for a reason. They are fun books to read. But as far as the world went, they tried numerous things. They tried producing other parts of the world of Kryn to tie into the Dragonlance campaign setting and open that up, and they didn't really do that well. They tried pushing adventures forward into exploring the further parts of the world, and they didn't do very well. So what they ended up doing quite a few times during the course of both second edition and into third edition was just to repackage the original story. So you had Tales of the Lance, which kind of repackaged in a way the original modules, and 3 compiled books of the adventure modules to go along with that. So you had all of that second edition stats and reprints of the material for the modules that you could then recreate that particular story in second edition. And it's similar. You can see a similar thing with Ravenloft. At touch points throughout the history of D&D since 1983 to very much the current day, the number of times that one adventure, the Castle Ravenloft, talking about the campaign setting, we'll come to the campaign setting, but the number of times that Ravenloft has been redone over the course is because it sells. That particular story sells. It was a very good story, but that shows you how market forces limit campaign settings. None of the other Ravenloft stuff did particularly well. The campaign setting was okay, but it was more trying to expand on what they could do, and hopefully, because of the popularity of the module, the campaign setting would take off. And it kind of did, and they tried to do the same with it as they did with Forgotten Realms, which is provide this metaplot supported by a series of novels and a series of adventures and so on. But I think that kind of lost the plot a bit. And Ravenloft is an interesting setting, but it lacks that flexibility and expanse and so on that the Forgotten Realms has. So we had that. The Greyhawk was seen as a point in time, and unless you as a dungeon master wanted to drive your own metaplot forward, then you weren't really supported with any continuous storyline. And the other ones were sort of largely looking back on things that had happened before and trying to build on that without little success, because the foundation wasn't strong enough to go and construct anything else on. But with the Forgotten Realms, you had this hugely broad base. So you could build not just one structure, one tower. You could build numerous of them all over the place. If some product line based on Callum Sham didn't work, then you could always build another one based on Moonsea, and the character of those two places was so different that you could almost guarantee that one of them would work. It also meant that because the Forgotten Realms was so expansive and so vast, it meant that the products that were released for it weren't so bolted down to the setting itself. So it was relatively easy to take a module from the Forgotten Realms and translate it into your own campaign setting or to anything else. Not so much the metaplot things, because unless your world was going down those metaplot routes, that was a little bit different. But certainly something like the Horde modules, the Empires modules, which the backdrop is you've got a Mongol invasion. Now, a number of worlds have some form of barbarian invasion. You only have to tweak that a bit, and then the modules themselves, which largely involve the player characters romping around in mountains, discovering strange kingdoms and trying to affect a plot that was entirely apart from and parallel to the big barbarian invasion that was going on. So even though it was metaplot and tied into novels, the actual adventure course itself was not. The metaplot was just the backdrop, and you could change that for anything else that roughly tied into it. So the modules were transplantable because of the flexibility of the Forgotten Realms as a setting in itself. Now I'm coming across as a Forgotten Realms fan here, which I'm not really a fan of any other world over any other world. I enjoy the Dragonlance books because of what they are. They're a different thing from the Greyhawk books. They're a different thing from the Forgotten Realms books. I'm not a massive fan of these things. I'm not a fan of these things to have bought all 100 to 200 or however many Forgotten Realms novels there are. Just a select few, and it just seemed interesting at the time. And the same with the adventure modules and all of that kind of stuff. It's just you picked and choose. If you were a DM or a player or whatever of my ilk, then you didn't throw yourself headlong into any one campaign setting. You had your own, because way back when you started this malarkey, you'd created your own campaign setting, and from that you were just using the rules to generate it. And in fact, I've used RuneQuest, Rollmaster, and Dungeons and Dragons of various editions to run games in my world. So it's not a world that is based on D&D. If anything, what I tend to do when I'm using a rule system is to mold it to the world, rather than try and mold the world to the game. But the Forgotten Realms is very much a D&D world. It'd be very difficult to keep its flavour and translate it into another game system. So if I'm a fan of any world, it's of mine. I created it when I was small, and it's still with me now, and I still tweak it, and I still run all sorts of things with it. This is exemplified, all of these things that I've been talking about, in the way that this product stuff and the metaplot for campaign settings went and so on. It can be exampled by just looking at TSR's catalogue of novels through Dungeons and Dragons related novels, whichever campaign setting we were on, over the course of the 1990s, and there are over 200 of them. TSR didn't just become one of the biggest publishers of role-playing games, or the biggest publisher of role-playing games, it also became one of the biggest publishers of fantasy fiction, largely tied into the properties that it had generated for Dungeons and Dragons. So all of this kind of tied together, it became not so much a publisher of games or a bunch of gaming hobbyists that were producing gaming materials for gamers. It became very much a corporate publishing powerhouse that was churning fantasy out like nobody tomorrow, like there wasn't a tomorrow. You may notice that I'm not really paying much attention to the development of the mechanics, because we did that in first edition, and the mechanics of second edition are not that far removed from first edition. But over the course of its decade, so it came out in '89, the last materials for it were arrived in 2000. And over the course of that decade of its existence, it supported at least 15 independent campaign settings. And when I mean independent, I mean entities unto themselves. Some of them, like the Horde setting, like Karatur, like Zakara, like Maztica, some of these were glued into the Forgotten Realms as a whole, and Taladas, that was glued into the Dragonlance setting, and so on. But they were published as separate campaign settings in their own right, with their own support materials. So as we've seen, most of the worlds and campaign settings that were released for first edition didn't have all of these supporting other products. All of the ones that were produced for second edition did, either computer games or novels or both, adventures, box sets, campaign expansions, the whole gamut, board games. There were just a ton. And this may seem great. This may seem, wow, that, such support, such broad, wide support for a game. This is fantastic. And in a way, it was. There were a lot of options for people to pick and choose from, and bring different materials to their own game, or go and choose one of the worlds and say, yeah, well, this is great. I'm being supported in this world, and so on. It was a good time if you were pro-choice, which I am pro-choice. It was like, that was fantastic. Off you go. We've got these lots and lots of different options for you as a Dungeons and Dragons player to go and choose from. But that's also a problem. Now, I want you to just consider this. If you're a fan of Tolkien, you only really have to keep up with 5 books, right? The 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings, which, okay, 6 books if you want to be pernicious, but the 3 of those: The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and if you want to go further, the Books of Lost Tales, The Unfinished Tales, and the Histories of Middle-earth series, and beyond that Christopher Tolkien is putting out. But at core, it's just those 5 books. You could understand those 5 books and be a Tolkien fan. If you are a Harry Potter fan, what is there? 7 books? And then, I can't say I'm a Harry Potter fan, but regardless of my thoughts about it, there is a finite number of books for Harry Potter, and yes, J.K. Rowling is writing more that are prequels and so on, but the core books that deal with the experience of Harry Potter through his time at Hogwarts is a finite set. If you're a Fritz Leiber fan, the Fafard and the Grey Mouse books have a very definite start and finish to them. If you're a Forgotten Realms fan, then you've got about 150 novels or more. In order to get through 150 novels that are based in the same world, you've got to be fairly dedicated to that one world. That doesn't need a lot of room for doing much else, especially if you're also gaming in this world, which means for Forgotten Realms, you've got at least 2 iterations of the core campaign setting in second edition. You have got all of the FR and the FRA and the FRC and all of these products and box sets and appendices and ecologies and just lots of product that was released for the Forgotten Realms. And that is the Forgotten Realms on its own. But if you want to be a Dungeons and Dragons fan during 2nd edition, are you going to keep up with all of them? That's a lot of novels to get through. That is a lot of campaign settings to be familiar with. That is a lot of product to try and get through. Now, this was the problem. The choice for the consumer was fantastic. The management of these from from TSR's point of view, I mean, it may have seemed that this was a great thing. It's just brilliant to work at this company that just allows any old idea to get out into the wilderness. I'm sure it was a lot more complex under the surface of the company, but these things were being churned out on a regular basis. New campaign setting. People stopped identifying themselves as fans of Dungeons and Dragons, as players of Dungeons and Dragons. People through the 90s began to identify themselves as players of Spelljammer, players of Ravenloft, Forgotten Realms players, Greyhawk players, Dragonlance players. So what happened was, effectively, TSR diluted itself. It diluted its output. It would sell a wide range of products, but those products were compartmentalized. There's no one player that was buying everything. And I bought a fair chunk of it, but there were things I didn't bother with. And there were people that were only concentrating on one product line. There's just no way that any one individual, unless they were a collector or a fanatic and that's all they did, there's no way that people would gather all of these things and play all of these worlds. I mean, it's one thing to buy every single D&D book that was going, but I bet the people that did that have not played every single book that is going. And what it ultimately ended up with is TSR being pretty much the only role-playing game. Obviously, there were a lot of role-playing game companies that had come through, but by the mid-90s, a lot of these ended up having to close their doors, and with TSR continuing to churn more and more product out, it was effectively competing with itself. So this wouldn't really manifest itself, at least not to us outside, until the sort of mid-90s, where, well, like I said, there was a number of companies that had gone by the wayside for various reasons. I mean, people turn around and say, oh, computer games took over, or card games took over, or this, that and the other. Vampire the Masquerade became whatever. There's these aren't really the reason. There was a lot of companies that were in financial problems during '95, and all of those factors combined were an issue. Created an environment in which a number of companies releasing product into a niche hobby, not least TSR, and the one company that should have been able to weather it was TSR. But it had diluted itself. It diluted its property to such an extent that it fell apart at the fringes, more or less. What it could count on, almost, was that the core rulebooks would always sell. The campaign settings materials wouldn't necessarily sell, because someone who is a Forgotten Realms player wouldn't necessarily buy Spelljammer material unless it had something to do with the Forgotten Realms. But core rulebooks always sold. So, in a similar move to the way they did it in '83 with recovering things, but that's kind of could be seen as more a branding exercise, and so was this really. What they did was they dropped the 2nd edition from it because 8 years down the line, people had realised that there were two different games floating around. There were two different things. So the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide and so on were republished. The format's changed a bit, but the rules are pretty much still the same, errated out and so on. So these came out in '97. And this was because something had happened to TSR. Was in 1997. So in '95, TSR was already in trouble, in financial trouble. It was struggling to try and meet production things. I think it had lost guidance in a way, but by 1997, TSR was pretty much dead as a corporate entity, and it was bought out by by one of its rivals, a rival that had produced the Magic the Gathering card game that was cited as one of the examples why role-playing games are flagging. So I don't buy that. A lot of people I knew were playing card games and role-playing games at the same time. They were gamers. It's entirely feasible for people to play more than one game, and definitely feasible for people to play more than one type of game. What really killed TSR was the inability to see what was going on, to read the market. The attitude seemed to be just swamp the market with product, and this will keep the company going, when actually swamping the market with product was very likely one of the things that killed it. So in 1997, Wizards of the Coast stepped in, they bought TSR, and they redid the core rulebooks in order to get some product out of there that's relatively easy. The material is already written, you just need to change the design of them, change the formatting of them, and get these out, and make a bit of money on the back of your purchase of this corporation. So here we go. From this book on, reading from the back, TSR is a subsidiary of Wizards of the Coast. So 1997, we had Wizards on the scene. Now, I sat in on some of the talks that Peter Adkinson gave back in the changeover between second edition and third edition, after Wizards had bought TSR and what they were doing and what they were planning and so on. And it's quite telling as to his insights into what was going on at TSR and why the TSR and the Dungeons and Dragons brand were failing. I mean, you've got to remember, this is a company that started off in the early 90s as being the biggest publisher of role-playing games, one of the biggest publisher of games in general, and one of, if not the biggest publisher of fantasy novels. And by 1997, they were out of money. They had one of the most recognizable franchises in the world and mismanaged it. And I found this quote from Ryan Dancy which sort of sums up. He was the guy that was charged with rescuing the Dungeons and Dragons brand and dealing with TSR and Wizard of the Coast, and exploring avenues that might come up with it. And if we'll touch on this in third edition when we get to it. But the one of his innovations, if you like, was to come up with the open game license, the OGL, and the D20 license, which came about a revival of third edition, or a revival of the Dungeons and Dragons brand into the 2000s. But the quote from Dancy, I'm going to read it because I think it's it's illustrative of the points I've been trying to make. So Ryan writes, "I know now what killed TSR. It wasn't trading card games. It wasn't Dragon Dice, one of TSR's failed attempts. It wasn't the success of other companies. It was a near total inability to listen to its customers, hear what they were saying, and make changes to make those customers happy. TSR died because it was deaf." And that was true. I kind of had first-hand experience of that. I can't help thinking that if TSR had scaled back the number of campaign settings they were going through, if they had focused on things of more products that were more generic nature, and supporting Forgotten Realms, sure, that was a surefire seller. Maybe Greyhawk, maybe Dragonlance to a certain degree, and then the bulk of the products that they were pushing out being of a generic nature that people could fit into any of their campaigns, then I think they would have done better. I don't know, this is speculation, and this is, hindsight is 2020, but I don't think it's hindsight when you're actually sitting looking at the sales figures and seeing that campaign setting materials were not selling whether it was because TSR were trying to just do what the American TV shows do, you know, produce a number of pilots, throw them all at the wall, and hopefully some of them will stick, and the rest of them will just be thrown in the bin. Whether they were trying to do that or what, I don't know. But it just seemed the number of campaign settings that were going about. They were announcing certain things like limited support for campaign settings, or like this is the campaign setting for this year, and we're not going to support it beyond the end of this year, and so on. But I think that was largely put in place in a cynical view. First off, to try and entice people to buy all of the product they pushed out during that year of its limited release. And second, I bet if the campaign settings that they'd put on those limited release had proven to be the massive runaway successes or something, or ended up being the next Dragonlance for that period or whatever, then I bet they would have continued them. But they just didn't. These games didn't sell because they diluted the market. And the reason why generic books by the rule books still sold was that they were the core of the game. The core of the game was still a saleable thing. The numerous different campaign settings were diluted your customer base, and that's kind of went on. And Ryan notes in his comments about the death of TSR. He notes that he went through warehouses of stock that they'd unsold because it wasn't selling. It was either marketed badly. I think perhaps they marketed badly. I don't know. It's difficult when you're actually involved in a game that's niche, because you're getting the magazines and you're getting the industry news, and you know people within the industry and you're talking to them about what's going on. There's a difference there, and being someone that's outside of that, I'm not sure I ever saw any advertising for the Dungeons & Dragons game, certainly not on UK television or in any magazines that weren't already to do with role-playing. So you know, maybe the marketing strategies were wrong, but I'm pretty certain that it wasn't anything outside of TSR that killed TSR. It was TSR that killed TSR. And so we come into the Wizards of the Coast era, the last few years of second edition D&D, and the first years of Wizards of the Coast taking up the property. Greyhawk got a relaunch of a sort, and that was kind of a precursor into what they were trying to do with third edition, and through the that would come through. They were reminding people that Greyhawk existed as a world, because one of the focuses of third edition was to use Greyhawk as a default world. So the rulebooks would use Greyhawk as a default world because it was so generic, and then other campaign seconds would modify the rules and the concepts and things from there. So Greyhawk was a solid foundation to go. So the second edition, the last few, you know, the relaunch in '97 of the Greyhawk campaign setting was a precursor to the later, it being included in 2000 in as the default third edition world. You got no new settings coming out. I think this isn't quite important. No new settings came out from '95. So all of the 15 plus campaign settings that were released for second edition Dungeons & Dragons came out within that period of 1989 to 1995. 6 years. 15 plus campaign settings in 6 years. You can kind of see where all of that stuff I'm going about diluting your player base and swamping the market with product comes from. But I've said enough. Instead, what Wizards of the Coast were doing was heralding back to the success of Dragonlance in a way, by saying, okay, things that have been proven to sell in the adventure and campaign market were fixed storylines or fixed plot lines. I mean, there's no doubt, much as I'm not a big fan of plot-driven or metaplot-driven settings, modules, adventure lines, whatever, there's no doubt that they sell. There's just no, it's been proven over and over again. So that's what they were doing. Big ticket, fixed adventures that were going through, you know, things like Night Below, things like Rod of Seven Parts, things like Return to the Tomb of Horrors, all of these things that were campaign based, long running, themed adventures that were not tied to a particular world. Okay, so Return to the Tomb of Horrors has got some Greyhawk elements into it and so on, but they were largely, you could put them in any world and with very little modification, and they would go. And they also tied into the nostalgia market. Now I've got a whole video on nostalgia and how that sort of runs around the role-playing industry wheel, but it certainly came through because in '99, there you go, became the 25th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, and they played on that. They produced a 25th anniversary box set. They redid a lot of old adventures, including Ravenloft, for the third time in second edition. I think it come through. I think there was a translation of from first edition to second edition of the Ravenloft module. Then there was the House of Strahd, which was a second edition iteration under the Ravenloft campaign setting of it, and then there was the 25th anniversary edition of Ravenloft. Damn things, just fifth edition has just released it for the second time. It's just insane. You may as well just call it the Ravenloft game. So a lot of these things that they were going through, Against the Giants was re-released for second edition under the 25th anniversary banner. Keep on the Borderlands was as well, and they also played into some of the 25th stuff, the nostalgia market, by just picking up art and turning that into adventures. So in the first edition Player's Handbook, I showed it earlier actually as part of my colouring in example. There was a piece, full page piece called A Paladin in Hell, showed a paladin carving through devils, and they made that into an adventure with a redrawn version of that particular page as its cover art. Quite an interesting adventure if you want an extra planar adventure to go through that's of a relatively generic nature. I quite like that one. So they pared down the product line. These gone were their multitudes of campaign settings, all pared down to a few that sold, to a few that they could build on, and that they could go head towards a third edition of the game that Wizards were developing. Along came the metaplot type things, as we had with the Avatar trilogy from the change from first edition to second edition. We had a similar thing with the culmination of the Vecna trilogy with Die Vecna Die, and another adventure called the Apocalypse Stone, which either espoused change or end of. So the Apocalypse Stone was all about ending the campaign. Die Vecna Die came about through the transition, changing. The world is now changed for better. And in the third edition books, Vecna turns up as a god. So he'd achieved his apotheosis and now was a god. And the campaign setting was changed. And coincidentally, the changes meant that all of the things that used to work in the way that described in the second edition rules now work in the way that's described by the third edition rules. Now I want to just point out a couple of things before we go into before we end the history section. We haven't focused so much on the specific products that were released. We've rambled on quite a lot about the way that these campaign settings were coming out, the way that TSR were managing to plug product packages, bundles of things, novels, computer games, and so on together in the release and supporting each mass release of product into the market. And we haven't focused so much on a blow-by-blow release of the rule books, or books that came out. Two reasons for that, really. First off, there's so much of material that was released for second edition. It would make this history section far longer than it already is, and it's long enough already. The second reason is because the books that were released didn't really do what the same thing that the books in first edition had. So in first edition, let's consider beyond the core books you had, and beyond, not including monster books, you had the Unearthed Arcana, which introduced new classes but also some new rules alongside new magical items and stuff like that. But it introduced some new rules into the game that fundamentally changed things. Weapon specialization and the expansion of the classes and level limits and so on. So they were quite subtle in the way it did it, but The Dungeoneers and Wilderness Survival Guides, they introduced a plethora of new rules to the system, including the non-weapon proficiency side of this. We'll put aside Oriental Adventures as a campaign setting more. So the rule books that were released for the actual core expansion rulebooks, if you like, that were released for first edition were few in number but pertinent in their application. What we got in second edition, we had the player's option rulebooks, the player's handbooks, things like the complete fighter's handbook, the complete dwarves handbook, the complete dwarves and halflings or something, the complete elves handbook, the complete book of barbarians, and so on. And what these books did was increase the amount of material that was built on the core rules. Very few of them actually introduce new rule concepts to the core of the game. What they do is they produce a number of kits being a sort of veneer that you could apply to a class in order to shape it in a different way. It may change some of the abilities the core abilities that class has, and give you some changes to the weapon proficiencies that they have, and so on. So these books were largely narrative discourses on the nature of whatever subject they were taking, and then expansions to material that was already laid out in the player's handbook. So kits were just an application of rules that were in the player's handbook, and a number of kits were produced. I mean, lots of kits were produced across 16 handbooks, I think there were. Probably get a little rotator up showing you all the ones that were released. The Dungeon Master's equivalents to those, so the complete Castles book on Campaign and Catacomb Guide, and the book on Sages and Specialists, all these things, they were really just expanding on the material, the advice material from Dungeons and Dragons. There were some of them that were more useful than others. The Campaign and Catacomb Guide gave some nice ideas about structuring campaigns and putting them together. The Monster Mythology was a fantastic book. It was like Days and Demigods for the weird, but again, all it really did was put into second edition the stuff that we'd already got in first edition. So yeah, rather than going through all of these releases, because they didn't have as much impact as the first edition equivalents to them, then going through them on a blow-by-blow history, saying, and this year this one was released, and this year this one, the chronology of them they're not important. Those books were not important enough to the game to warrant a blow-by-blow thing. And I'll give a list somewhere on the screen somewhere, maybe, of all of the books that came out that were those core ones. But to actually do that, the volume of books that were released and the nature of those books, a blow-by-blow isn't so important to the game as it was for the foundation books that came out for first edition. That is a potted history and probably somewhat of a rambling rant of second edition. And I can't really say that I'm a fan of what direction the product lines took. The number of campaign settings and everything else, all of that stuff, I think you can probably tell that didn't impress me very much. But the second edition books as a whole, brilliant. I think up to that point, it was the best, most coherent version of Dungeons and Dragons that had been released, and coincidentally was the first edition of the game, the first edition of role-playing games in general that I'd been published for. So it was really second edition. Did quite a lot for me in terms of that side of my hobbies. Had me going to different parts of the world, playing dungeon mastering to different sets of people in different ways, winning trophies. There we go. European champion in 1993 for Oriental Adventures. But I mean that's itself is an example of how the dilution things was. It wasn't that 1992 third place Spelljammer, European Spelljammer tournament. I didn't play that much, mostly Dungeon Masters. But when I did, I used to take one of the funny side of things like Dark Sun and Spelljammer and so on. But that's an example of what I was saying. The fact that you had, instead of a Dungeons and Dragons tournament, you had an Oriental Adventures tournament, you had a Spelljammer tournament. It kind of exemplifies what I've been saying. I truly think that TSR would still exist today, successfully publishing Dungeons and Dragons as a game, probably in a completely different form than it is now, if those first 6 years of their second edition efforts were not focused onto flooding the market with so many different campaign settings and products. That's the history. For the play section, what I'm going to do, instead of giving a kind of a blow by blow of the second edition rules as we did with first edition, is I'm going to refer you back to the first edition game and then take you through some of the differences that we go through and explain why the changes were, in my opinion, this is all opinion piece, why in my opinion they were for the better. So the first aspect out is the rule books, the way they were put together, the nature of the rule books. In first edition AD&D, and again I refer you back to the character generation video that I did for first edition. By 1987-88, you had so many books to deal with, so many books to either drag to the table or to having beside you while you were trying to do things and write adventures or create characters or whatever. It got a bit daft, so that needed paring down. Secondly, because we're all players of the game, it made sense that the rules for the game were in the player's book, rather than the rules for the game being in the Dungeon Master's book, and then just a few bits and pieces were in the player's book. So moving the core of the rules from the player's from the Dungeon Master's Guide into the player's book, I think that was an excellent move. I don't think it could have happened for first edition in that way, because of the nature in which it was written, the circumstances in which it was written. They had to write it in such a way as it was still a saleable product all the way through. And the Dungeon Master's Guide for first edition is quite a hefty tome. But certainly, when they came to second edition, I think the revision that they made to move the bulk of the rules into the player's handbook and keep the Dungeon Master's Guide as literally that, a guide for Dungeon Masters. You've got some material in there that's for DM's eyes only, like magical items and so on, but the bulk of it is how to set campaigns up, how to set adventures up, how to manage the game as a Dungeon Master. So I think the shift in focus there is good. The rules are in the player's handbook. Guide for Dungeon Masters is in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So the second good thing about it is that the player's handbook consolidates a lot of the material that we were using as core from first edition. So, like I said, weapon proficiencies, non-weapon proficiencies, determination of height and age and weight and all of that side of things that we had to go and delve into the non-player character side tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide in first edition, that was now in the player's handbook. So everything that you needed to create a character, from class, from race, to height, to age, to weight, to encumbrance, to all of these things that were scattered around a number of books, were now just in this one book. You only needed to create a character, you only needed one book, unless you went into the realm of kits and those kind of enhancements, in which case you would need all the rest of them. But generally speaking, the player's handbook, that's all you needed. The classes were also arranged for better clarity. So in first edition you had the fighter class and then paladin ranger subclass. Now what you had was class groups. So you had the warrior group, of which the fighter, the ranger and the paladin were part of. The priest group, cleric and druid. The wizard group, the mage and the specialist wizard. the rogue group, the thief, and the bard. Now, the reason why this made sense is it made the language that the books talked to you about the rules easier to manage. It made the vernacular easier. So in first edition, it mattered whether the word fighter was in italics or not, because if it was in italics, it would mean one thing. If it wasn't in italics, it would mean the other thing. It was either referring to the class proper, or it was referring to the class and all of its subclasses. In second edition, if it was referring to the class, it would say fighter. If it was referring to that group as a whole, it would say warrior. So you knew exactly what a particular rule was pertaining to. If it said warrior, it applied to fighters, rangers, and paladins. If it said fighter, it only applied to the fighter class. There was no mix-up in language there. The vernacular was made easier to understand. And as I noted in the history, it expanded the classes out quite a lot. It gave classes more options. So if you played a priest of God A, you had a different set of abilities in general to a priest of God B. You could play a specialist wizard that was an illusionist, or a transmuter, or a conjurer, or summoner, or a necromancer, or a transmuter, whatever. So that also gave you lots of different options to play around with. Thieves, instead of going, you are at this level, so your pickpocket space is this percentage, instead of that, it said, okay, these are your base percentages at first level, and you get this number of points to play around with to adjust those scores as you see fit. So if you had a thief that wasn't really bothered in learning how to read languages or decode things, then you didn't have to put anything in read languages. You could just be, you know, the biggest, most amazing searcher of traps going, but you couldn't pick a lock or decipher some strange language for toffee. Well, it was up to you. You had the option to doing that. And obviously it got rid of all of the rule breaking, rule bending weirdness that was involved in first edition bards. With the options, with the developing the options, and also the introduction into the core of the game, albeit as an optional rule, but into the core of the game of weapon proficiencies, that cut out the need for so many different classes. So it was much more interesting to see in the pages of Dragon Magazine and so on, and in the various source books that came out, instead of more and more classes being introduced into the game, as you saw with first edition. Instead of that, you got kits that gave you a different shading of a particular character class, and were a lot more manageable than a class itself. It's easy to create a class that's a kit that's balanced. It's not so easy to create a class that's balanced. So it was easy to do, or to put all of these things together. And if you were running your own world, it was easy to come up with these things that were pertinent to your world as well. So if you wanted to, if you had a particular set of gods and you knew the nature of those gods, and so you wanted to create specialist clerics for those gods, you could do so. Cleric spells were parceled up into domains, into spheres of fire and what have you. So all you needed to do was to say that, okay, this particular kind of cleric covers these particular spheres, and so therefore those spheres of magic are the ones that they pick their spells from, rather than you cleric, so there you go, you've got one spell list, or having to do it on a spell by spell basis or whatever. It just made it that unlike first edition, second edition did feel more like a Lego kit that you could assemble your campaign world from. Albeit that the focus of the product that they then kicked out for it was more aligned to expecting you to play one of TSR's own campaign settings, but it was very much easier to manage and easier to build things from, because the framework was so nicely put together, nicely packaged. So things like weapon specialization now became core to the game. They tweaked things like the level limits for non-human characters. They were greatly expanded on. No longer did you have to worry about your dwarf being 7th level or something like that. They were very much greatly pushed forward. They still existed. Those level limits were still there, but they were kind of advisory. The Dungeon Master's Guide basically was saying, you could the reason why the level limits exist is because of this. But if you want to play around with them, then here is some advice on how to play around with them. Not quite so hard and fast in big tabulated form as they were in first edition. You still got dual class and multi-class. The concept of those largely remained unchanged from first edition. We weren't yet in the era of third edition where you have your character level progression and you can just choose which class that you push that into. You're still in the realms of at first level you are a fighter wizard. If you could choose to be a fighter wizard if you were an elf, say, and the rules for that splitting experience and points is largely not changed. Some nice simplifications. So the encumbrance rules, not changed too much from first edition, but certainly bringing in the concepts from the Wilderness Survival Guide and bringing in those important tables from the Wilderness Survival Guide into the Player's Handbook, so that encumbrance could be calculated during the course of character generation without having to delve into a couple of other books in order to work it out. Like the weights of everything were in the Player's Handbook. You didn't have the weights for the equipment that was listed in the Player's Handbook in the Dungeon Master's Guide. You had the weights and the costs together for all of the equipment that was going, and then the tables based on your strength as to how much encumbrance you were carrying were also in the Player's Handbook, along with the movement rates and so on, and what you could do. Weapons now, instead of the idea of weapon space required, you had a size of weapon, small, medium, or large. And then that could be tied into things like if you're halfling, then using large weapons is going to be very difficult to you, and that was just simply based on this abstract thing. So the weapon required, weapon space required, wasn't necessary anymore. You also had damage type associated with each weapon, so either slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning, and that tied in also into the rules. So instead of having a big sort of armor class adjustment by armor class type, you could provide modifiers to say if against this particular type of equipment, or against this particular type of monster, or against this, if you're applying bludgeoning damage, then it either takes half damage or it's harder to get through to damage at all, so therefore provides an armor class bonus or whatever. So instead of having per weapon a set of armor class adjustments, you could have per damage type any special exceptions to the rules. So skeletons, for example, skeletons take half damage to all but bludgeoning damage. There you go, that was it, that's all that needed to be said. Instead of the combat tables, it was already the idea of to hit armor class 0, THAC0, was already being introduced and used in first edition and in basic Dungeons and Dragons, where you just get the value that a character needed to target to get their to hit an armor class of 0, and then you could calculate what armor class they hit based on the roll that you'd achieved and your THAC0. Now that had replaced the mechanics. You didn't have no table looking up by level or by character type or whatever. All you had there was the THAC0 for each character class and how that THAC0 improved. So fighters, for example, they improved their THAC0 every level, and wizards less so. I think 1 every 4 levels or something like that. Their THAC0 would go down. I'll correct myself somewhere if I remember that wrong. But so So calculating the target numbers needed and the combat side of things was made a lot easier by making THACO the core mechanic rather than tabulated lookup. And my old bugbears of surprise and initiative were very much streamlined as well. So in second edition, initiative was basically rolled a 10-sided dice, and you used things like spellcasting time, which was listed as an initiative modifier, and weapon speed, which is also listed as an initiative modifier, to figure out when people attacked in a round. The lower your initiative on your D10 roll plus modifiers, then the better. The lower initiatives went before higher initiatives. And instead of having this, like, trying to calculate which segments people would act on, especially if they've got multiple attacks, and then you work out which segment that first edition used. Segments have gone in the bin now, and with multiple attacks, it was basically the concept was you've got 2 attacks, so you make your first attack on your initiative, and then wait for everyone else to have a go, and then you get your second attack. So it was much more, game controlled. Game organization rather than the specifics of trying to use abstract timing sections to break a round up into, oh, okay, so now it's segment number 7, so you get to do this. All in all, from an organizational point of view, and from the abstracting where needed, so everything uses a consistent level of abstraction rather than some things being overly detailed, layered on top of a system that is abstracted already. From that point of view, so from the layout, from the organisation of the rules, from how everything's put together, and from the consistency of the rules as they've been brought in, second edition Dungeons and Dragons is by far easier to teach, to learn, and to play than first edition Dungeons and Dragons. You may have nostalgia for first edition Dungeons and Dragons, but believe me, the nature of play doesn't change that much for the advantages that you get in being able to play the game itself without getting strange about things between first and second edition. Second edition is like a cleaned up, polished version of first edition. I've already covered the complete handbooks in the history section and what they added into the game, but they didn't add so much in the way of complexity, but they certainly expanded the materials that come on. So suddenly, if you brought in the rules from the handbooks, and these included additional proficiencies, the kits, as I've said, new items of equipment, and so on. So if you included those, the experience that you had with first edition in juggling 5 or 6 rule books to create a character suddenly became in second edition dealing with the player's handbook plus a lot of these complete handbooks. Well, that's not truly fair. You'd only need the complete handbook that you were dealing with for your class, and maybe the complete handbook that covered your race. So let's say 3 books. If you add in the Tome of Magic for the new magical stuff in there and spells, then 4 books. Okay, so it was still more compact, shall we say, than first edition. Certainly easier to present certain campaign concepts if you've got fighters from a particular nation use these particular weapons and they're really well, and they're not familiar with those type of weapons, so they're really rubbish at them, and they all know certain skills and wilderness abilities or whatever. Then they were really easy to jot down as a kit. It didn't take so much. If you're creating a class, you have to balance its hit dice out with the experience point progression, and for those used to 3rd, 4th and 5th edition, we're still in the realm in 2nd edition of classes having different experience point progressions. That hasn't been unified yet. So you have to balance that out with the hit dice, with its THACO, with the saving throws, with all of these things that are mechanical to the game that determine how good one class is over another in that particular area. So balancing that out is quite hard. If you get a kit And a kit only has a few parameters, and a lot of them are just the colour and nature of the thing. They're not directly mechanical. Yes, you could apply saving throw bonuses up and down in whatever, but you're just talking about easy to deal with compartmentalized areas. So a kit is far easier to put together and balance than a class is. Far easier. So the advent of kits made open doors to colouring in a campaign setting with the crayons that you wanted to use a lot better. The final rules to be released for second edition game were the player's options and the DM's options rulebooks, and these were interesting. What they looked like to me, and bear in mind that I played a lot of different games, from RuneQuest to Traveller to Call of Cthulhu to Dungeons and Dragons to Rollmaster to all sorts of different games. So when you read a book written for one game that very much feels like it's drawing mechanics from another game, it becomes a little bit probably more marked, more obvious than if you are reading a book. If you read the player's options books, for example, and the only game that you played was Dungeons and Dragons, then you would have missed the subtleties. But if you played a broad set of role-playing games and you read the player's options books, you could see where the influences of those were coming from, and some of the authors of those that were involved in putting those books together. You can kind of see where those influences are also being lifted and why they're coming in. But there's interesting things in there as well, like the skill system in the player's option book can be seen rather like a precursor to the way that the skill system worked in third editions. The player's options books are really, really interesting. I think another part of them was feeling out certain systems. Like there's a spell point system in there, rather than the sort of Vancian system that Dungeons and Dragons uses, which, you know, a caster memorizes a bunch of spells per day. Once a spell is cast, they forget that instance of that spell. So by the end of the day, if they've exhausted all the spells, they then have to read their books and rest up to regain those spells back for the next day. Spell point system means here are the spells that you know, and here is a number of points that you've got to cast them with. It's the points that get exhausted, not the spells. So you never forget how to cast a particular spell. What you do is mentally or magically exhaust yourself so you can no longer cast any spells. It was an interesting set of books. Those players' options books, if you really want to go to town on taking Dungeons and Dragons, or at least second edition Dungeons and Dragons, as a basis, and then building your own game system that suits your way of play, then I kind of highly recommend, you know, checking those books down and giving it a go and having a tinker. If nothing else, it will teach you a bit about putting games together and balancing out the different components of a role-playing game system. It's an interesting exercise. But with the players' options books, you could really meddle around and come up with, form the core Dungeons and Dragons mechanic, advanced Dungeons and Dragons mechanics, and change them, swap them around, move things around, choose this particular option that you want to do, and create the game, or fashion the game, reforge the game to better exemplify the nature of the game that you want to play and the world, the campaign setting that you want to follow. So a review. Well, hopefully that you've seen, as far as a game is concerned, hopefully you've seen that, in my opinion, second edition is the superior game to first edition. Essentially, it's the same game to first edition, with the corners knocked off, and it being of a better shape and a more coherent presentation. The author, Dave Cook, he poured a lot of experience into reformatting first edition to create second edition, asked a lot of questions, often went back in the pages of Dragon magazine and to things like in surveys, product surveys and so on, to see which directions, and really had a good think about the game itself. I think he did a really good job at putting second edition together. It's just a shame that it wasn't long after publishing second edition, this glorious culmination of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons line, that it was shortly after that, somewhere in the mid-90s, that TSR kind of lost their way and just stopped listening to the people that were playing their games. And at the start of it, many were sort of sceptical of what would happen in the second edition. We'd read things from Dragon magazine, we'd read the columns that Dave Cook had pushed out, that Gary Gygax had pushed out earlier than that. And we were worried, and it's the same, when you're a fan of thing, or when you've been a fan or a player or whatever you want to call it of something for that long, you do, when something new is coming out that is along that lines, you are you do worry a bit, and it's the same. Part of the worry isn't that everything's going to change. I think part of the worry is that is combined with, that everything is going to change. You don't know the extent that it's going to change to, but more importantly, the game that you are familiar with is going to end. You'd either have to carry on playing the old edition that you knew was never going to get any support again, or bite the bullet and see what bits you could tinker with that you didn't like about the second edition game. And it was quite gratifying that when second edition first came out, there's a lot of the stuff that we had house ruled we didn't need so many notes because they were in the core game in one form or another, maybe in a different form the way that we'd house ruled them, but still a way that we could manage. Yeah. And the other nice thing was that because there weren't so huge changes between the two, I did an article once. I wrote an article that explained the differences between first edition and second edition, and they're not unmanageable, and they're not so different from each other that products from one edition won't work with products from the other edition. If you consider picking up a first edition module and running it with third edition, then there's quite a lot of preliminary work that you need to do in order to have the right statistics and everything else to be able to run that adventure. For running something from first edition and second edition, the stats pretty much were the same. There's not really anything that changed drastically enough to have to completely change tack or whatever. So you could easily pick up a first edition module and run it with second edition with no difficulty at all. So in essence, for those people that wanted to stay with first edition, it depends how stuck in the mud or engaged in the edition was that they were, but people that wanted to stay with the core rules of first edition found that things that were being released for second edition weren't so different. They could still work with first edition. So I think both of those, the fact that it was backwards and forwards compatible, or the products were, I think that was to the benefit. So I think from my own perspective, not in the least because second edition it's formed the bulk of my convention going years, as you can see by the state of my original player's handbook and the way that's held together with tape and things. It's well travelled and well used, and but I just think it is it's just a really good edition of the Dungeons and Dragons game of any first to fifth. The second edition is, I think, still stands as one of the best editions that was released. Mileage varies on the player's options front. I think they were more of a transition thing. There were a few things that were released in support of the player's options, a couple of modules and things that were released in support of those, but by the time they came out and second edition was really on its last throes. So I think from that point of view, the core game is a 5 out of 5 from me. I think it would be daft for it to put anything else. It was the first one that I received money for writing for. and it was the one I did the bulk of my my convention dungeon mastering with. So I think I've played put more hours of table play time into second edition than any other game that I've played. So 5 out of 5 for the core games. If you add in the players option stuff, it's difficult to rate that because the options were just books of options, so you could put the game in any direction you wanted. So I'm not going to rate them because the rating for me, in my opinion, would depend on which of the multiple options you chose to fit together in which way. So, you know, and you would have chosen those options because they felt right to you. So you would probably give whatever you built with them a 5 out of 5, and I could give it whatever I decided on the time. So I'm not going to rate them. They're good books. I enjoyed reading the players options books. I did use them a little bit in tinkering some of the later bits of games, but you know, by the time we'd actually used them in anger, then 3rd edition was around and everything kind of changed. So essentials. Well, the essentials are pretty much the same as 1st edition. The Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and in this instance the Monstrous Manual. Now, the monsters were first released in a loose leaf form in the Monstrous Compendiums for 2nd edition, but the Monstrous Manual gives you all of the essential monsters in one book. So those 3 books, they're again drive-through RPG, available on PDF. I think they may be print on demand as well, I'm not sure. And if you want a good module to pick up as a starter to get you into the game, then I think Destiny of Kings is a pretty good adventure that will help you get a feel for the way that 2nd edition runs. It's not too overcomplicated and not too fixed into a particular campaign setting, so you have to go and learn a load of lore to understand what the module is saying. I would urge you. I know I've spent most of this video ranting about the number of campaign settings that TSR pushed out. What I don't mean this to be is a negative criticism on those worlds. I think some of them were ridiculous and pointless, but some of them presented some really, really nice ideas. So I would urge you to go and try out those campaign settings, and some of them have been released for other editions of Dungeons and Dragons as well. So you know, you may get hold of those editions of the campaign settings and try them with those rules as well. But those campaign settings that are different from your normal medieval European setting. I mean, yeah, okay, Oriental Adventures and Samurai and all of that. That's fun. I love them. But what I'm talking about is things like Spelljammer and Dark Sun, especially. Those 2 campaign settings are introduce to the Dungeons and Dragons line some things that are special and different. And I don't mean different in let's go and introduce constructs as player character or whatever. I mean they are truly different worlds with different natures to them, and the way that you play them is necessarily different than the way you would play in any other world in a Dungeons and Dragons context. And it's interesting to see a Spelljammer ship in Baldur's Gate 3, or at least the adverts for it, the opening trailers. Another interesting one would be Planescape. That kind of builds on the Manual of Planes for 1st edition and the information about the planes as a setting that in the Player's Handbook and various other publications for Dungeons and Dragons over the time. The Planescape was a bit different in presenting the planes as something not something that is a novelty and a difference and something that's out there for the players to go wow at because they've come from a material world and have suddenly found themselves in the planar world, but from the perspective of characters that are from that planar world and how they would traverse around that planar world, and so the weirdness is used to it. If you like the Torment computer game, and the way that goes, then that's built on the Planescape campaign settings. So Planescape is another one that I would urge to. It's interesting, the fact that it has its language all of its own. It has an art style all of its own. It's quite good, and it's just different. It's not quite as different in play scope as Dark Sun and Spelljammer, but certainly in the way something familiar, the planes, is used as the backdrop for adventures. So it does end up being a little bit different, especially when you've got some of the adventures that do a lot of plane hopping around. Dead Gods is a really good example of that. It does follow a bit of a narrative channel. If you're like me, you may get a bit frustrated that it's a bit railroady, but it's a good example of how a Planescape game can hop all over the place into different places and take advantage of that planar setting. So. In summary, 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is a gem. It takes everything that was good about 1st edition, reformats it, puts it into a comprehensive form, rewritten, taken all the unnecessary complications out of it, and then represented it as something that is coherent and easy for people to pick up, and consequently easy to play at the table. So yeah, one of the best editions of Dungeons and Dragons that has been published to date. Thank you very much for listening to my rambling. I'm sorry this has been so long, but